So the reading I chose this morning is from Paul, 2 passages from Paul, and it'll be obvious in the course of the homily why I chose these particular readings, because the first part, particularly from Romans, is Paul at his most torturous best. Romans chapter 9, verses 7 to 20, the law and sin. For apart from the law, sin was dead. Once I was alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang into life, and I died. I found that very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death. For sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived me, and through the commandment, put me to death. So then, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous and good. Did that which is good then become death to me? By no means. Nevertheless, in order that sin might be recognized as sin, it used what is good to bring about my death, so that through the commandment, sin might become utterly sinful. We know that the law is spiritual, but I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good, as it is. It is no longer myself who do it, but it is sin living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good that I want, but the evil I do not want to do, this is what I keep doing. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me that does it. If you're not confused yet, keep listening. The armor of God from Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 to 12. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Words inspired by God. Many, many years ago, I had a very powerful vision in which I saw a pregnant planet. It was planet Earth, and she was pregnant with humanity, gestating and about to give birth to humanity. And I was watching it, and this woman was in profile, so I could see her greatly extended belly, and I could see into it, and I could see that humanity was being conceived and carried and about to be birthed. And I could see the umbilical cord attaching the baby to the mother. And you know the umbilical cord has two functions. Firstly, it is the vehicle through which the mother feeds the baby. And secondly, it is the vehicle through which the embryo eliminates waste matter, which accounts for some of the morning sickness that a mother is going to feel at some stage of the pregnancy. And as I was watching this vision, I could see the liquid flowing through the umbilical cord. And sometimes the liquid looked to be crystalline and clear, in which case the mother looked vibrant and healthy. And at other stages, the liquid was murky and dark and clogged. And at this stage, the mother looked wan and listless. And at the end of the vision, I was told that the meaning was the following: that the liquid flowing through the umbilical cord represented the thoughts and the words and the actions of all human beings. And that the quality of our thinking and the quality of our speaking and the quality of our acting determined the health of not just the baby in utero, but the mother carrying it. That the very planet itself was dependent upon the thoughts, the words, and the actions of the human species whom it was conceiving, carrying, and about to give birth to. And that's what I want to talk about today. So I want to look at the problem of evil. In theology calls it Theodicy. And it's the oldest and most vexatious existential human problem ever faced. There have been lots of attempts to unpack this. So theology has wrestled with it. Sociology has wrestled with it. Psychology has wrestled with it. Philosophy has wrestled with it. Science has wrestled with it. And some of the explanations have been simplistic and some have been very complex, but none of them have been satisfactory. And so I decided I'm going to give it a shot myself. Now, over the years, in the last 33 years since I've lived in Palo Alto, I've addressed this occasionally in an individual homily. But I noticed that for the last few weeks, firstly, Hannah Burke and then Karen Rubin asked about issues regarding this, the problem of evil. And so I decided I'm going to devote the next 3 homilies to try to wrestle with this notion. And the reason it's 3 is that there are 5 Sundays in January. So normally there are 4 Sundays in the month. And the first Sunday I give a homily, the second Sunday I give a homily, then the third Sunday I recap the previous 2 and we have question and answers. But there are 3 homilies in a row coming up now. So today, February 7th and February 14th. And then on the 21st of February, I'll recap the 3 of them and open it up to question and answer discussion. And so I decided I'm going to have a full tilted effort to try to wrestle with this notion of theodicy, the problem of evil. And so over the course of today and the next 2 weeks, with God's help, I'm going to dip into 5 or 6 totally different explanations for it. And I'll mention them just quickly here and then focus on 3 of them. And so the oldest one we're familiar with is that all evil comes from the sin committed by Adam and Eve. And so that's one explanation, that all evil comes from the fact that Adam and Eve disobeyed God. The second part you'll find in the scriptures is the story of Job. The book of Job was written about 550 BCE, when the last 2 tribes of Israel are exiled in Babylon. And they come over under the influence of the great Zoroastrian religion. And at this stage, they begin to wrestle with the great existential issues. Is there life after death? Where does evil come from? And so the whole book of Job, 42 chapters, is dedicated to this. And when you actually read the book, chapter 1 and 2 and chapter 42 are basically just an old Semitic story. And then the intervening 39 chapters from chapter 3 to chapter 41 are trying to unpack this existential issue of the problem of evil. So there's a great treatment of it in the book of Job. Not a very satisfactory one, but a big treatment of it. Then you look at the teaching of Jesus. What did Jesus seem to suggest, are the causes of evil? And he seemed to suggest that it was demons, very definitely demons, and also what he called the world. And the world is a very strange phrase. And he uses it again and again and again, particularly in John's gospel. And you'll find the very same teaching in the Essenes teaching. They talk about the struggle between light and dark. So when you listen to Jesus' teaching, he seems to suggest that there are 2 origins for it. That the world, and we have to unpack what that means, and demons. When you look at Paul, and this is the reason I chose the reading today, Paul suggests there are 4 origins, for the problem of evil. There is the flesh, the good that I would, I do not. It is the evil I do not want to do, I find myself doing. And then the law, suggesting before there was law, there was no sin, because sin is the breaking of law. So if there weren't law, there wouldn't be sin. Then he talks about the world. He uses the same phrase as Jesus Christ. The world is a cause of evil. And then he suggests as well, non-terrestrial energies or beings, the beings of the heavens, dark beings of the heavens. When it comes to Augustine seems to suggest that all evil flows from original sin, the first sin our parents commit. And then sixthly, I have my own theory. So that's what I'll be going through for the next 3 weeks with God's help. So it's going to take me 3 homilies to try to do any justice to this issue. But today, I'm just going to focus on 3 of those elements. I'm going to focus on the Genesis explanation for it, Augustine's explanation, and then my own theory. So in Genesis chapter 3, we find the story of the fall, the sin of Adam and Eve. And this story is written down about 950 BCE in the southern kingdom of Judah. And the story allegedly is that, you have a nomadic people who've been wandering in the desert all their lives, and now they're beginning to settle down into an agricultural lifestyle. And they're living in a land, although it was allegedly flowing with milk and honey, that experiences regular droughts and regular famines. And they look around them and they find, the world in which we live. Women have a lot of difficulty in childbearing. Agriculture is really difficult. Very, very often there are droughts and famines. There's constant war and there's constant exile, various kinds. And so they're trying to figure out, what is the origin of all this stuff? And they come up with the belief system that, Adam and Eve sinned. God gave them a commandment. He gave them all the delights of the Garden of Eden, but there were 2 trees from which they were not allowed to eat. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. And then allegedly they're tempted and by the serpent, or some kind of demonic entity in disguise as a serpent. And so they disobey God, they employ their free will and in service to self, their own greed of some kind. And therefore the first sin and karma are born at the same time. That God kicks them out of the garden in perpetuity and says, and don't attempt to come back in here. And if you have kids, don't think your kids can get back here or your grandkids. And he stations cherubim with fiery swords at the gates of the Garden of Eden to make sure they don't get back in. And so for these people, nomadic pastoralists now settled down to an agricultural lifestyle, looking around them and trying to make sense of the world in which they live, they're going to come up with an explanation. And this was their elegant, mythical explanation. And it worked for them. Belief in that worked for them. So we find that then from that getting kicked out of the garden, according to this story, that there's this gradual slide out of alignment with the divine order of the cosmos until finally war and greed and genocide, and drought and famine are the order of the day. So for people living, 3,000 years ago, that was a satisfactory explanation. This is how it all happened. So that would be the Genesis account of how evil got started. Augustine was a native of North Africa. He flourished around the year 400. And as a young man, he was a complete rake, absolute rake. In fact, he became an illegitimate father. He had a child, even though he wasn't married. But then he converted to Christianity. And like many, many converts, he became stricter than people who were born to the religion. So Augustine had a very, very simplistic and a very different explanation for the origin of evil. Now, to give you the context, you have to realize that Augustine flourished at a time. He was a Roman citizen living in North Africa, which is part of the Roman Empire. At this stage, the Roman Empire is under assault from the barbarians in the north of Europe, the Celts and the Goths and the Vandals and the Huns and whatever. And in fact, they sacked Rome, a few different times. And so Augustine is totally convinced that the essence of being divine or being godlike is reason and rationality and order and bureaucracy in some senses. When everything has its place, then you are most godlike. And he came to the conclusion that people are most irrational at the moment of orgasm. When they're making love and they experience orgasm, they're totally irrational, they're totally out of control. And it's at that moment that the baby is conceived. And Augustine came to the conclusion that the baby is conceived when the parents are most ungodlike. And so original sin is the fact that babies are conceived in concupiscence, when we're most out of alignment with God. And therefore, the consequences are the following, Augustine said. Because of this original sin, our will is weakened. The good that I would, I do not. It is the evil I do not want to do, I find myself doing. What Paul calls the flesh. So our will is weakened. Our intellects are darkened. We can't really see the truth or really what is. We're living in an illusion of some kind. And thirdly, our bodies are subject to illness and death. If it hadn't been for the way in which we were conceived, according to Augustine, then we'd maybe live forever. We'd be immortal beings. Now, it's interesting to me that certainly Augustine understood the consequences. Whatever happened, he understood the consequences, because our will is weakened, our intellects are darkened, and certainly our bodies are subject to illness and to death. However, his attribution of those consequences to the fact that children are conceived during an organismic experience of the parents, that for me is total mishigas. But that was the explanation of Augustine, and it was an explanation that Christianity bought into, and for the next 1600 years, it pretty much drove our understanding of the problem of evil. It all came from original sin, and only two beings, avoided that: Mary in her Immaculate Conception and Jesus. So that was Augustine's hit on the origin of evil. I'm going to spend the remainder of this homily kind of unpacking my own understanding, as I've thought about this over the years. And so I want to try and give a background to where I kind of formulated this thinking from, and then I'll tell you what the thinking itself was. So to give a background, I believe that the notion of sin actually went through many, many different iterations, that at different stages of the human journey, we looked at sin very, very differently. And I'm convinced that the original understanding of sin was that it was the breach of a taboo. In other words, occasionally people would have some kind of a mystical experience, and this happened through drumming or dancing, or entheogens, or music, and some or meditation of various kinds. So people who were not prepared sometimes had these extraordinary mystical experiences. And when you have mystical experiences for which you're not prepared or into which you're not initiated, there are two huge dangers. The first danger is madness, the inability to subsequently operate in this ordinary world. So if you blunder into an experience of God and you're unprepared for it, uninitiated, you can go totally mad. And so it says in the scriptures, it is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God. If you don't know who you're dealing with or what you're dealing with, and you blunder into such an experience, you're going to go crazy, absolutely crazy. Or secondly, you're going to get totally inflated. You begin to think, what a great, guy I am. Look at what the experiences I'm having. And so it's a kind of a virulent form of narcissism. And so in the absence of some kind of initiation or some kind of mentoring, to prepare us for these experiences, it is very dangerous when they happen unbeknownst. And so you get maybe stuff like when people started messing around with the LSD and mescaline and stuff like that, and they weren't prepared, they didn't have a theology or a mystical tradition, they had some really great experiences, but then they couldn't integrate those experiences into ordinary life. And so somehow being initiated, having mentors, or studying this in some way seems to be very, very important. So I believe then that the elders originally put kind of protection around these experiences so that the uninitiated didn't blunder into it and have experiences that they couldn't subsequently, process. And we call those, that defense, we call it a taboo. There's a taboo about this. So I believe that the first notion of sin actually was the breach of the taboo. People who didn't honor the elders, attempt to protect the uninitiated from these experiences, breaching that, I believe that was the first sin. And the consequences are then that people have experiences that they can't process and they can't integrate into society. So I think that was the first, I believe that may have been the first notion of sin. The second notion of sin, I think, came much, much later. And it's the notion that individual gods made covenants with the individual tribes of people. So I think that, there are three kinds of gods we meet in the kind of the scriptural literature and the mythological literature. The first one are tribal divinities who attach themselves to particular groups of people and wander around with them, like the Israelites and Yahweh. And then there's a second kind of gods who are regional divinities. They're located in specific parts of the world, and you come into their territory, you have to be obedient to them. You go into a different territory, you're obedient to a different kind of a god. So that's a second kind of god. And then you had what I would call portfolio divinities, gods who specialized in particular things like art or war or agriculture. And you really want to get a leg up in the opposition as an artist or as an agriculturalist, this is the guy you need to be kind of paying obedience to. And so now, whichever god you decide to follow as a group of people, and this was not an individual choice, there was a tribal choice, then there was some kind of a covenant made with this divinity. And so the second notion of sin, I believe, was that there's a breach in the covenant, that you've sworn fealty to one god, but now you want to kind of follow a different god. Like the Israelites around the year 800, when they found out that Yahweh was a really good warlord, but he was pathetic as an agricultural god. And so there's constant drought and famine in the land. So they want to go change allegiance to a different god, a god called Baal. So the second great notion of sin then is the breach of a covenant between a tribe and a particular divinity. I think the third iteration of sin may have been the breach of a specific commandment. So at some stage, the gods began to hand down lists of laws that people needed to follow. And this is much, much older than the scripture, than the Bible. So the first such code is called the Code of Ur-Nammu, and it comes from the year about 2100 BCE in Mesopotamia. And this was a codification of laws handed down by a god long, long before there was Abraham or the people of Israel. Then the law of Moses, is given on Sinai around the year 1250 BCE. And for us Celts, we had a different version. It was called the Brehon laws, which regulated Irish society right down to the 1700s. And so in this understanding of sin, then sin is the breach of a particular law. So that would be the third one. So sin has changed its definition many times. But the main sources of evil and sin seem to have to do with our relationship with the gods. So all sin somehow is some kind of a breakdown in our relationship with God. So that's a very brief kind of history of my understanding of the evolution of sin. I want to look then at my understanding of the evolution of the notion of personal culpability, or how that began to move. And as I worked my way through the Judeo-Christian scriptures many years ago, I think I identified 6 different phases of how culpability changed. So the first one we find again in Genesis chapter 3, where Adam and Eve sinned by eating the fruit. It's not an apple. The word apple is not used. It's fruit. So they eat the forbidden fruit. And then God comes down and they discover that they're naked as soon as they eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Before that, they were little children. They had no understanding of morality. They weren't immoral or they weren't moral. They were simply amoral. They didn't have a morality whatsoever. And now their eyes are opened and they're aware that they're naked and they hide. And God comes down in the cool of the evening, as he was wont to do, to walk in the garden. And he can't find Adam. He says, Adam, Eve, where are you guys? And very shamefacedly they come out, covering their loins. And God said, where were you hiding? And why were you hiding? Because we were naked and we were ashamed. And God said, who told you you were naked? And Adam says, this one that you gave me, Eve, she ate the apple that you told her not to eat, and then her eyes were opened. And God says, why did you do that? And he said, it wasn't me. It was the serpent that you put in the garden. He's responsible. And so I call this the passing the apple stage of culpability. Nobody will take responsibility for anything. So that's the first stage, culpability. And you see that in small kids. The dog ate my exercise or whatever. So they refuse to take any responsibility for the consequences of my actions. So that's the first stage of culpability. The second stage then, I believe, is that everybody gets punished. It's called corporate singularity. And ancient societies operated under this notion of corporate singularity. If an individual within the tribe broke the covenant or committed a sin, the whole tribe was guilty. Now, that doesn't seem to make much sense to us, that we think that only the person who broke the law should suffer. With the notion of corporate singularity, everybody is responsible, even if one person commits the sin. Now, in actual fact, we actually still practice this quite a lot, particularly in our international policies. In our war, for instance, against Saddam Hussein in Iraq, we killed 750,000 Iraqi children because of embargoes on medical supplies. And when Madeleine Albright was asked on 60 Minutes, is this an adequate price to pay for American foreign policy in the Middle East? She said, yes, we believe so. It was okay to kill 750,000 Iraqi children in order to get at Saddam Hussein. So one person has sinned, Saddam Hussein, and we're going to kill 750,000 Iraqi children to get back at him. So the notion of corporate singularity was a stage in the notion of culpability, and it still lives, it's still alive on planet Earth. That would be stage 2, I think. Stage 3 would be then the notion of the scapegoat. So when the people of Israel are wandering in the desert for 40 years, and Aaron has been made the high priest by Moses, once a year, all of the individuals come to Aaron and they confess their individual sins. And then Aaron takes all these sins and he takes a spotless goat from the herd and he puts his hand on the goat's head and he confesses the sins of the entire people onto the goats, and then they chase the goat off into the desert to be eaten by lions or whatever. And that's the origin of the phrase scapegoat. The goat took on the sins of the entire group. The New Testament will pick up on this and make Jesus not the scapegoat, but the scape lamb, who will take away the sins of the world. So it's the same notion, that even though everybody is guilty, one person is now going to pay the price for the rest of us. So that will be the third phase of culpability. The fourth phase comes then a little bit later on, where God repents, of punishing everybody in perpetuity. So he says, heretofore, from now on, I'm only going to punish the sins of the parents to the third or fourth generation. So I'll punish the kids, I'll punish the grandkids, and I may punish the great-grandkids, but I won't punish the great-great-grandkids thereafter. So this loving, compassionate God is not going to commute the sentence just to 3 or 4 generations of people. So that will be like the fourth iteration of culpability. Number 5 comes about the year 600 BCE with 2 great prophets, Jeremiah, who flourished about 600 BCE, and Ezekiel, who flourished about 50 years later. And both of them quote an old Hebrew proverb that says, the parents have eaten sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge. So normally if you eat sour grapes, you're the person who feels the sourness. But in this case, they believe that the children would feel the sourness. And now Ezekiel and Jeremiah said, that's not going to be the case anymore. From now on, only the person who eats the sour grapes, only their teeth will be set on edge. Thereafter, nobody else is guilty, only the individual who commits the crime. That was like stage 5. Now you think that that's as good as it gets, but it's not. There are 2 more stages after that, I believe, and they come in the life of Jesus. So stage 6 is, Jesus says to the Pharisees and the lawmakers, you hypocrites, you bind heavy loads and you put them on people's shoulders and you won't lift a single finger yourself to assist them. In other words, he's saying that people who legislate, terrible laws are responsible for those who breach those laws. So it's not just the criminals always who are responsible for their actions, but ridiculous laws that have been imposed on them by bureaucrats of various kinds or legislators of various kinds. So Jesus says, you're hypocrites, you're binding the loads, you're putting them on other people's shoulders, and you won't lift a single finger yourself to help. And then the final stage is not so much what Jesus said, but what he did about this situation. He dedicated his entire life to healing the sin of the world. He didn't take it away because nobody can take it away because we have free will. But he dedicated his entire life to living with love and compassion so that he was impregnating the very planet itself with the energy of forgiveness and the energy of love. And that for me is the final stage of the notion of culpability. And that's the invitation to anybody who's serious about their spirituality or their mystical spirituality. It is becoming forgiveness. It is becoming compassion. It is becoming understanding for the sins of the world. Not railing against it, not getting angry about it, not getting violent about it, but bringing a totally different energy. The energy of planet Earth is not going to be shifted by a counter-violence. It's only going to be shifted by a counter-lovingness. So that would be my understanding of the movement of culpability. Now I'm ready to get into my own theory of the problem of evil. And if I were to look at the sources of evil, I would say there are 6 origins, and I'll just mention a few of them briefly, and I'll deal with them in more depth in next Sunday with God's help in the second homily in this section. So I think that the first source of evil or difficulty is personal karma, since I believe very, very strongly that we incarnate many, many, many times, and that an individual, brings we bring with us all of the karma of past incarnations. And karma is not necessarily a bad thing. Karma is simply the consequences of the choices we've made previously. And so the loving things we've done, the compassionate things we've done, the forgiving things we've done, we carry all that with us into incarnation as well. So karma is not just a negative energy that we carry from lifetime to lifetime. It's the entire energy of the soul's trajectory through previous incarnations. But certainly every single one of us has done bad things in previous lifetimes, and we carry that burden with us in order to try to resolve it. So to kind of paraphrase or butcher Wordsworth, where he says, trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home. It's also true that I would say trailing clouds of karma do we come from our past lifetimes. So one origin of the evil we experience in any lifetime is the karma we bring in with us as individuals. We also come into a world, Gaia, which is contaminated in some senses by the karma of all earth life that existed before us, including previous incarnations of current life forms. So we don't come in just as individuals. We come in as communities. We come in as a member of all sentient beings on the planet. And every life form, brings with it its karmic past. And so we're born into a world in which we're not just experiencing personal karma, but we're experiencing the karma of all the life forms that preceded us. That's number 2. Number 3, I believe, is that the physical spacesuits into where we're born. And in some senses, these spacesuits have 3 different kind of elements. There's the physicality of it, and there's the emotionality of it, and there's the intellectuality of it. There are 3 components to the spacesuit. So these physical spacesuits, particularly that we come into, are the results of billions of years of murderous behavior encoded genetically and epigenetically in our DNA. We come from a long line going way back to the very first cells, of murderous behavior. Plants, we see it in plant life. There are plant parasites. Many of the oak trees where I live, at the top of them are covered with, the mistletoe. And mistletoe is a total parasite. It contributes nothing to the tree, but it leaches the tree. So there are parasites in the plant kingdom. If you've ever seen it, the Venus flytrap is a beautiful flower that opens its mouth, really, really gorgeous, and a bee or a fly will go into it and it'll snap shut and it will eat the insect. And it's a plant. So plants have the ability, to be murderous. So all the ways from dinosaurs to mammals to hominids, our planet seems to operate, on an equal parts between, cooperation and competition. So even as human beings, we still carry at the back of our head, we carry the reptilian brain, and in the midbrain, we carry our mammalian brain, and in the front brain, we carry our neocortex. And in actual fact, each of these components of the brain is contributing to evil in the world. Our reptilian behavior, fight or flight, is there. Our mammalian emotional life is there. And our neocortex allows us to create all kinds of weapons of mass destruction. So we're actually living inside spacesuits that have a predisposition to good and to evil. So that would be a third factor of evil in my experience. The fourth element I really believe is what Paul calls the influence of the powers of heaven. So that, and I'm going to treat this in much more depth in the next homily, so that there are literally non-terrestrial energies and entities who intervene in human affairs. And I'll speak about that in more detail next time. So that would be a fourth influence on what we experience by way of evil on planet Earth. The fifth element, I believe, was the wedding of free will with advancing technology. And so technology is neither good nor bad. It just depends on what uses we put it to. But certainly we've experienced in our times a science without conscience, leading to a life without meaning. And so when you ally free will to this kind of technocracy, you've got big problems. We have a technology without ethics, which leads to a greed without compassion. So when you start marrying free will to evolving scientific technology, you've got the possibility for great good and you've got the possibility for great evil. That'll be a fifth factor, I believe. And then the sixth one, I believe, is this whole notion that God is dead. And God is dead not because source was a fabricated illusion, but because we have lulled our inner divinity to sleep under the onslaught of consumerism. Evolution is meant to be not just a development morphologically and intellectually, but also spiritually and even mystically. And so instead of abandoning the religious impulse, we need to transcend the religious impulse. And so I'm going to try and finish on a positive note and then pick up on that later. In spite of all this extraordinary, difficulty we experience on planet Earth now and in former generations, we volunteered to be here. I'm totally convinced every single soul on planet Earth volunteered to be here now, not just any time in the past when things were better, or times in the future when things might get better, but right now when things are the way things are. And we volunteered to be here, I believe, for three reasons. The first one is we are the way in which God experiences. Left to our own devices, God, who is all in all, cannot generate experiences because there is nothing which is not God. And so she plays this game that Hinduism will call the game of Leela. Leela is where God self-fractures, Hebrew will call this netzotzim, into little bite-sized pieces of herself in order to generate experiences. So every perspective on life is a perspective that's being brought back to God so that she can experience it. That's the first reason we volunteered. The second reason we volunteered was so that the individual soul could learn how to love in all circumstances. It's easy to love when things are easy, but when things are really, really difficult, it's harder to love, particularly to love those whom we regard as the enemy. The second reason we incarnated was to learn how to love in all circumstances. And we'll have as many incarnations as we need until we learn that lesson, not just intellectually, but at a deep, deep soul level. And the third reason we incarnated was to help Gaia become Christ conscious, that this very planet itself has a trajectory, an evolutionary trajectory that began in God's womb and only ends when it goes back to God's heart. And so I want to finish with another vision I had some years later after that first one. And in this vision, I also saw planet Earth. And I saw that there was this extraordinary grid system of lights surrounding the planet. And it was obvious to me that every line of longitude and every line of latitude where they intersected, there was a being of light stationed. So if you can imagine this lattice surrounding the Earth, every line of longitude where it intersects a line of latitude, there's a being of light stationed, and one at the North Pole and at the South Pole. And when I subsequently, when the vision ended and I did the math, I calculated there were 64,442 light beings attached to planet Earth. Now, it's a symbolic number, obviously, but what it tells me is that we are not alone in this journey. When you volunteer for life on planet Earth, which is the boot camp of the galaxy, the most difficult planet on which to incarnate, because it's equal light and equal darkness, equal love and equal anger, that we did not volunteer to be on planet Earth at any stage, particularly this stage, without having that support from God. There were literally thousands and thousands of light beings who are holding our planet in their embrace, in their hearts. So we're not alone in this journey. We are being held. Namaste.